the TG for a few more hours. Let me also greet our sponsors from Aberdeen Cables. I'm very happy that a little earlier the speaker from Aberdeen Cables did mention that their company and therefore the workers in that company benefited from our localization. That means that procurements of their products have to come from South African manufactured sources, and that is an important tool to support industrial development. I also want to greet my colleague, Elizabeth Tabeti, the members of the diplomatic community, and also just to mention that among the business people that I met before we started, at least one came and told me that his company was a beneficiary of our Black Industrialist program. And that gives me an opportunity to say that this is a program that is actually very tightly controlled in terms of access. You have to be a real industrialist with real skin in the game. And I'm very happy myself to testify to the quality of the people that we've supported. And I want to say that at this point, in terms of the DTI incentive, we have now supported, we have approved applications from over 70 black industrialists, and our target is to reach the 100 by the end of this financial year, in other words, by the end of March. And that is in addition to many more that might not have got the DTI incentive, but may have come onto programs run by financial institutions like the Industrial Development Corporation. Let me just say that I'm going to try to talk mostly about the challenges that I think the new digital revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, is going to pose for us. And I'm doing this because I've just come back from the World Trade Organization in Buenos Aires. And although that conference actually ended up in a stalemate, there was no substantial outcome. Electronic commerce and the global rules of electronic commerce. And those discussions are going to continue and are going to guide us in a range of interactions over the coming years. So I want to talk mostly about that, but I do want to locate that discussion in the context of the phrase which will shape a lot of discussions here at the ANC conference, which is radical economic transformation. And I think if we go to the definition that has now become the guiding definition of all our discussions, it says that radical economic transformation is about bringing about fundamental change in the structure of our economy, as well as in the patterns of ownership, participation, and inclusion to the benefit of the majority of the people of South Africa, who happen to be mostly black and female. That's the broad definition. That's a paraphrase. It's not the actual quotation. But it's referring to two aspects, that we need to bring about fundamental change in the structure of the economy. And I think that speaks very much to the work which we've been trying to pursue in the DTI over a number of years. And it really sets out from saying that our country still, and our continent in a much more profound way, remains integrated into the world economy. We are integrated into the world economy, so it's not that we need to become integrated into the world economy, but we're integrated as producers and exporters of primary commodities, minerals or agricultural unprocessed primary commodities, and we are importers of finished goods and services from around the world. That's the place that we're in. And I think that any economist, any analysis will tell you that that is the least lucrative place to be. And as technology is changing, the proportion of the value of a final product that is constituted by the raw material in it is a diminishing proportion. That is the reality. So really what substantial change in the structure of the economy means is it means we have to move up that value chain. We have to diversify our economy. We need to industrialize, in a word. And we have taken over the years the view that South Africa can't do this alone. It has to do this as part of a larger regional economy. And that larger regional economy needs to be more than our immediate region of SADC, although we will be working quite energetically with SADC countries to give effect to the SADC Industrial Development Strategy during the time that we're the chair of SADC. But it needs to embrace more than that. It needs to embrace large swathes beyond SADC of the African continent with the eventual destination of the Continental Free Trade Area. That's our goal, that's our quest, that's what it's all about. And I think I want to say that over the years, we've developed a suite of industrial policy incentives, and we've also been gearing our programs and policies around promoting inclusion and participation around that overall concept. And so I think that the TG mentioned, we of course have a range of incentive programs. Those incentive programs are all intended to support investment in productive activity, and then also to support raising the competitiveness of companies by making actual investments that raise the competitiveness. And all of those are around building new industrial capacity. And then I think when you look at some of the ways that we have been changing the shape of the BE scorecards, we're trying to emphasize and support those forms of empowerment which are not simply allowing companies to take someone onto the payroll as the public relations officer, but actually support the people who are benefiting from empowerment to become real players in that company, to become real managers of whatever that business of that company is, to become also companies that are going to create space for, in their supply chains, for the emergence of new black-owned companies as suppliers. And so supplier development and skills development have become you have to reach a sub-minimum on the scorecard in order not to suffer a penalty of a reduction on the place on your overall scorecard. And that's been quite intentional. And then, as I've already mentioned, we're complementing that by actually seeking out the black industrialists that we have and seeking to take them to the next level by a range of incentives which are targeted on the same sort of thing, identifying very precisely some investment that's going to raise their competitiveness and supporting that with an incentive, a dedicated incentive program, which I might add, the money that the DTI has spent on the Black Industrialist program has all come from reprioritization. We didn't get any additional money from the fiscus. That's what I wanted to say. So just on a few of these, I think it's, of course, the case. We know that our economy is not performing as well as it should be. We continue to work very energetically in our space to promote and build confidence in the different sectors. I can say that one of the pieces of work that we have been engaged in recently is the new automotive development program that will replace the current program, which expires in 2020. It's been located within something called the Automotive Master Plan. And that exercise, which we're not in a position at this stage to make any precise announcements, but it has been engaged in very inclusively and with a high level of rigor with all of the key stakeholders, the original equipment manufacturers, the component manufacturers, and also the trade unions. So this has been a highly inclusive process. And although in the end of the day it remains for government to make a call on the actual way in which the program will be rolled out, one of the features of that is that we are seeking to strengthen the local content that is being made in South Africa in components, and also to create some space within that for black companies to be part of automotive supply chains. We've also been working quite significantly and seriously in the clothing and textile sector, where I think we've seen a quite remarkable turnaround over recent years, where a number of local companies have taken our incentive, increased their competitiveness, and have actually become really companies that are taking advantage of the window, about a month window between an order being placed and an imported product arriving. It's called fast fashion, working with retailers. And we've now got to the point where retailers are now beginning to invest in clothing manufacturing in South Africa. That's the kind of thing that we've been looking to do, and we continue to engage there. And then I think, as Aberdare Cable would be an example, many companies that have been involved in infrastructure rollout programs, we've been seeking to increase the localization, and also, I might add now, to improve the enforcement of localization, and that is happening in a number of ways. We will be monitoring and evaluating through Department of Performance Monitoring and Evaluation the localization programs across government, but also we will now be working with the Auditor General, who will be making findings in due course, because if there is a practice note issued by National Treasury on localization, it's no longer an option, and if you don't do it, it's non-compliance with applicable legislation and should be an audit finding. But as I said, what I really want to speak about is that as we pursue radical economic transformation driven by our own imperatives, our own imperative is to raise the level of growth and also promote greater inclusivity in our economic growth. In other words, to set ourselves on a path of higher level of more inclusive economic growth. As we try to do that, I think we have to understand that there will be a radical change, as usually called disruptive change, in the nature of production as a result of some very profound technological changes which are taking place. I'm sure everyone has heard something about what's called variously the digital industrial revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, or Industry 4.0. But I just wanted to say that when I was in Buenos Aires a few days ago, I came across some very interesting discussions that I think are beginning to situate this in a very significant context. And I want to quote from one of these papers. It's by a gentleman called Parminder Singh of India, who wrote a paper for the Commonwealth. And this is what he said is underway. He said, as industrialization placed machine power at the center of the economy, digitalization makes digital intelligence the new fulcrum. The factory as the site of mechanized production was the central economic institution of the industrial age. For the digital age, it is sectoral platforms that reorganize entire economic activities in any sector based on digital intelligence arising from data. In other words, what we're going to see now is that whereas if you like, in the industrial age or up to now, it's been industrial firms that have been sitting at the head of value chains, whether those value chains are global or whether those value chains are domestic or regional. What we're going to be seeing in the near future, and already what's beginning to happen, is that it will be data management and digital firms that will be at the apex of value chains, and manufacturing will be in a subordinate place in those value chains. That's what's beginning to happen. And it's all associated with the adoption and development of new technologies. And in addition to what I just said, the digital technologies will be applied in industries. We already see this in South Africa, but we're not by any means at the cutting edge of this. We see this in the form of robotics. We will be seeing it in the form of the Internet of Things, in the form of 3D printers, in the form of artificial intelligence. And this will create, as the phrase goes, disruption. It'll bring about disruptive change. It's not going to be incremental change. It's going to be disruptive change. And it's not just going to be manufacturing or productive activities that are going to be affected. It's going to be service sectors as well. It's going to be entire value chains, but also activities within value chains. That's what's staring us in the face. It has all kinds of implications. Among other things, I think it will mean that the barriers to entry of small enterprises could well be lowered. A number of these technologies will mean that the quantum of fixed capital that might be required of an enterprise will go down, as you can use digital technologies and build on digital technologies and innovate around digital technologies. But at the same time, I think it's going to have huge consequences for workers, because workers will be involved in production processes in which increasingly they will have to master some digital technology and probably will require some post-school education as a point of entry into industrial processes. We're already seeing this in South Africa. If you walk around the motor companies, for example, you'll see people operating digitized or roboticized processes. When I speak to those people, they've gone to TVETs, they've had some form of engineering or ICT-related qualification. That seems to be the base of entry into industrial activities. It could also mean what's called reshoring, where there will be a bringing of productive activity closer to consumers. This could affect developing countries in the form of traditional bases on which developing countries have sought to industrialize on the basis of cheaper labor. It's not our game, but it's the game of other developing countries. This will become less important than other considerations. And so, for example, earlier this year, I read that Adidas had shifted a number of its productive activities from low-wage countries in Asia back to Germany, because they said that 3D printing and robotics and artificial intelligence was just simply lowering the cost of production, lower than the cheap labor advantages in Asian countries. So I think we're going to have to adapt ourselves to this reality. I have become aware of a couple of buzz phrases that I'm not sure that everyone is aware of. One is called GAFA. GAFA is Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Alibaba. Those 5 companies are in control of 85% of cross-border digital transactions at this moment in time. You'll see that 4 of those 5 are from the United States and 1 is from China. Those are the dominant forces in the digital economy as it stands now. They have emerged from different processes described in significant detail in the paper I already discussed. In the case of the United States, there has been a push for open access on a global scale, liberalization on a global scale, and here's another buzz phrase I came across: the digital 2 dozen principles, starting with no tariff charges on cross-border internet transactions, no localization, no this, no that, no the other. And this is included in, for example, the digital or e-commerce chapter of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which the United States has recently walked away from. That is the model that's been sought and driven by the United States. China, I think we've got a lot to learn from what China did, but not necessarily what from China wants us to do right now, because they are now a very significant player through Alibaba. And what they did was there was a very significant state control of the whole internet sector, together with a lot of state nurturing through very often borrowing, if you want to put it in inverted commas, from other technologies, until eventually they emerged with globally competitive companies. The paper also points out that there are other models, the European Union and India, where there are more of a public-private partnership model in trade, where they have public infrastructure, the rollout of the broadband infrastructure networks and public policy frameworks, but then a huge amount of support and encouragement of entrepreneurs and startup companies. That characterizes both India and the EU. Now, I think that what we need to do what we need to do as Africa, because I said I'd just come back from the World Trade Organization. We didn't end up agreeing with anything, but there is enormous, strong pressure mounting for us to all sign on to the digital 2 dozen. I think if we do, we will probably find ourselves having the ability to develop our own digital industrial policy significantly and seriously constrained. But what is it that we want? That, I think, has to emerge from a much more profound and deep discussion, not just in South Africa, but across the African continent, about our digital industrial policy framework. In the DTI, we have a stream of work that's attending to this. There's also work being done by the Department of Telecommunications and Postal Services around many of the infrastructure related, but also the rollout, the entrepreneurial support programs for the digital economy. So I wanted to just mention that because I think that however we look at these issues, industrialization, moving up the value chain will require us to engage with this huge technological change that is happening. And if we don't, I think we will find ourselves not being able to use this as a force for good, but we could find that this becomes a force of widening inequalities and for us to remain in a subordinate location. Because I think that the reality is that these technologies have the ability to seriously improve human life, to create opportunities for new entrepreneurial development, for many more small businesses in our own country, but also if they continue to be adopted in a context of a world which is characterized by winner-takes-all markets, with devil take the hindmost, with huge monopoly rents being earned, and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development had some figures in the report this year which told us that the top 100 companies were now earning what they call surplus profits, profits above what they would regard as a normal profit, which had risen from about 26% in the period up to 2000, 1995 to 2000, to something like 40% today. So there's a very significant widening of those kinds of profits associated with monopolies and with the ability to command and dominate in a context where, as I already said, we have 5 companies around the world dominating this new technology right now. How do we get in? How do we move further forward? I'm sure that this is going to be a piece of work that we're going to need to engage with. Let me then conclude by just mentioning a few of the trade developments. I did say that our efforts to industrialize, even as we take account of this technology change, are going to have to take place beyond the borders of South Africa. I think that is for very good reasons, that if you look at China, India's of this world, and if you look at the trends in the developed world, even if at a certain point in time a country like China was able to support its industrialization by exporting large quantities of manufactured goods to the developed world, that's not available in the same way to every other follower in the same way. For a number of reasons, not least that there is not sufficient growth in those parts of the world, and secondly because those economies are themselves trying to reindustrialize, and they're just not as open as they used to be for large quantums of manufactured goods. And so the Chinas and Indias are turning to their own domestic markets, but they have large populations, large purchasing powers that can support significant diversification. Our 55 million people don't give us that. Even in SADC, it's a bit better, but it's not sufficient. And we need to start to turn to the numbers, which the tripartite SADC, COMESA, East African Community, and eventually the continental FTA will provide. And so our quest has been development integration, which is combining trade integration, the creation of free trade areas, combine that with infrastructure development, and also cooperation on industrial development. So where are we on this journey? Earlier this month, we met in Niger. The president of Niger is the AU champion on the Continental Free Trade Area. And at the ministerial level, we agreed that there are a couple of documents that are ready for signature early next year. They include the framework agreement and the framework on trade in services, which we've not had in any other regional arrangement. These are still at the level of frameworks. In terms of the work which we've been doing over a number of years on the tripartite, we would have by now have concluded the tariff schedule agreement between the Southern African Customs Union group of countries and the East African Community, which includes Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania is already covered by SADC, but also Rwanda, Burundi, South Sudan, that group of countries. We would have concluded, but I think, as you all know, there was quite a lot of delays arising from the issues in the Kenyan election and then establishing a government. So I am hopeful that we will now be able to conclude that by the first quarter of next year. That will be a very significant set of commercial opportunities, because the framework in would be new opportunities in those important markets, as well as for East African countries. Their tea, coffee, very